Good evening, and welcome back to Sleep Current. This is another Unsolved History Explained Before Sleep episode. And tonight, we're going to spend some time in a quiet valley in central Norway, a place where winter nights are long, the air is often very still, and the surrounding hills make the sky feel unusually close. At first glance, Hessdalen Valley looks like many rural valleys in Scandinavia. Small farms, a few scattered houses, forests climbing slowly up the hills on both sides. It's peaceful, maybe even a little isolated. But for more than 40 years, people living here have occasionally looked up at the night sky and noticed something they couldn't quite explain. Lights. Not stars, and not quite like aircraft either. Sometimes they appear as small, distant glows above the mountains. Other times they're brighter, hovering quietly over the valley for several minutes before slowly fading away. And every now and then, witnesses describe them appearing low enough that watching from a window starts to feel a little uncomfortable, almost as if the light is closer than it should be. People talk about them for a while, and eventually the stories fade. But that didn't happen here, because in the early 1980s, the lights started appearing often enough that scientists decided it was worth taking a closer look. Researchers came to the valley with cameras, radar equipment, magnetometers, and radio instruments. Their goal wasn't to prove anything extraordinary. They simply wanted to answer a practical question. If these lights really were appearing above Hessdalen, could they actually be measured? Over the years, the researchers gathered a surprising amount of data: photographs, video recordings, occasional radar detections, and at times, small electromagnetic disturbances recorded at the same moments the lights were seen. Yet even after decades of observation, no single explanation has managed to account for every sighting. Some observations have fairly ordinary explanations. Others remain difficult to categorize. And recently, the investigation has entered a new phase. Modern monitoring stations now watch the valley using high-resolution digital cameras and automated systems designed to record anything moving through the night sky, which means that today, the lights of Hessdalen are no longer only stories told by residents. Sometimes, they are captured directly on camera, and in certain recordings, the behavior of the lights still raises difficult questions. So tonight, we're going to take a careful look at what has actually been documented here: the witness accounts, the scientific investigations, and some of the more recent footage that continues to keep researchers interested in this small Norwegian valley. Because when you step back and consider the full history of the phenomenon, one thing becomes clear. This is not simply a story about lights in the sky. It's a story about what happens when scientists try to understand something rare, inconsistent, and strangely persistent. And even after more than 40 years of watching the skies above this valley, one question still remains. What exactly is appearing over Hessdalen? For many people living in Hessdalen Valley, the mystery did not begin as a scientific question. It began in a much simpler way. People started noticing lights in the sky more often than usual. At first, it wasn't treated as anything particularly unusual. Someone might casually mention seeing something late at night, a light moving slowly above the hills, a glow hanging quietly over the valley before disappearing. In a small rural community like Hessdalen, news travels in a quiet, informal way. People mention things in passing, at the local store, during conversations with neighbors, or while standing outside in the cold evening air. One person would say they had seen a strange light the night before. Someone else might reply that they had noticed something similar a few days earlier. At first, most people assumed there must be an ordinary explanation, perhaps aircraft passing overhead, or distant headlights reflecting off clouds or mist. But as the early 1980s continued, the sightings became harder to dismiss. The lights were appearing too often, sometimes several times in a single week, and people were describing them in remarkably similar ways. Residents spoke of glowing spheres drifting slowly across the valley, sometimes hovering almost motionless in the air. Other lights seemed to move steadily along the valley floor before gradually fading. What made many witnesses pause was not just the appearance of the lights, but their behavior. They were often completely silent, and they sometimes remained visible for a long time. Unlike meteors or aircraft that pass quickly overhead, some lights stayed in view for many minutes, occasionally even longer. One resident later described watching a bright light from inside their house late one evening. At first, it appeared distant, just another glow above the dark landscape outside the window. But as the person continued watching, something began to feel unusual. The light didn't blink like an aircraft. It didn't move in a straight line. Instead, it seemed to hover quietly over the valley. Then it began drifting slowly in the direction of the house. The movement wasn't fast. If anything, it felt almost deliberate as the light gradually crossed the valley floor. The strangest part was the silence. No engine, no wind, just a steady glow moving slowly through the darkness. Eventually, the object passed directly above the house, and from that angle, the witness said it no longer looked like a distant point of light in the sky. For a brief moment, it seemed more like a solid object moving overhead, something round, possibly disc-shaped. That realization was what made the experience unsettling. Until then, it had been easy to assume the light was far away. But when it passed over the roof of the house, the witness suddenly had the impression that whatever it was, it had been much closer than expected. Shortly after that, the person stepped away from the window and closed the curtains, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the situation had begun to feel strangely uncomfortable, almost as if the object had come just a little too close. Stories like this began spreading quietly through the valley. At first, people spoke about them cautiously. No one wanted to sound overly dramatic, but the sightings kept happening. Neighbors compared what they had seen. Farmers noticed lights while working outside at night. Drivers reported glowing objects moving slowly above the road. And sometimes several people would report seeing the same light from different parts of the valley at the same time. By the early 1980s, the phenomenon had become a regular topic of conversation in the small community. People weren't necessarily frightened, but they were curious and increasingly puzzled, because the lights didn't behave in a consistent way. Some appeared as steady, glowing spheres. Others moved slowly across the valley. And occasionally, witnesses described lights that seemed to change brightness or divide into two separate lights before disappearing. It was this variety, combined with how frequently the lights appeared, that eventually attracted attention beyond the valley itself. By 1983, researchers from nearby universities had begun hearing about the reports. At first, the story sounded like many other local mysteries. But when investigators visited the valley and spoke directly with residents, they realized something unusual. The sightings were not isolated. They were happening repeatedly, often in the same areas, and sometimes witnessed by several people at once, which meant something rare in the study of unusual phenomena. This was not a single unexplained event. It was something that seemed to return, again and again, above the same quiet Norwegian valley. And that meant scientists had an opportunity they almost never get. If the lights continued to appear, they might actually be able to observe them. And that idea would soon lead to one of the most unusual scientific investigations ever carried out in rural Norway. And that investigation began to take shape in the winter of 1983. By that point, reports from Hessdalen Valley had begun spreading beyond the small community itself. Students, engineers, and researchers from nearby institutions had heard the same stories that residents had been sharing with each other for months. lights hovering over the valley, objects drifting silently across the hills. Sightings that sometimes lasted far longer than aircraft or meteors normally would. At first, the idea was fairly simple. If the lights appeared often enough, perhaps observers could position themselves in the valley and simply wait. So a small group of volunteers began organizing observation trips during the winter months. They brought with them cameras, binoculars, radios, and measuring equipment. Nothing particularly sophisticated at first, but enough to begin documenting what they saw. Some nights they sat outside in the cold for hours. Hessdalen in winter is not a comfortable place to wait for long periods. Temperatures often fall well below freezing, and the valley becomes extremely quiet after dark. But that quiet was exactly what made it useful. With little air traffic, minimal light pollution, and long winter nights, the valley created unusually good conditions for observing the sky. And then, during several of those observation nights, the lights appeared again. Observers described glowing objects moving slowly along the valley floor, sometimes hovering for extended periods before fading or accelerating away. In some cases, the lights seemed to change brightness while moving. In others, they appeared as steady spheres drifting silently through the darkness. Word of the observations gradually spread. What had started as a small Norwegian investigation began attracting attention from researchers elsewhere in Europe. Over time, scientists and engineers from other countries, including Germany and Italy, became interested in the phenomenon and traveled to Hessdalen to participate in the research. Some brought additional measuring equipment. Others contributed cameras, sensors, and analytical tools designed to record the lights more precisely. What had begun as a small group of observers watching the sky was slowly developing into something more organized. Eventually, this effort became known as Project Hessdalen. The goal was straightforward, not to prove a particular theory, but simply to collect reliable data. If the lights were natural phenomena, the measurements might reveal how they formed. If they were misidentified aircraft or other human-made sources, the observations might help rule that out. But if the phenomenon behaved differently from anything already known, the instruments might reveal that as well. As the investigation expanded, the equipment became more sophisticated. Cameras were placed in positions where they could watch large sections of the valley sky. Observers carried binoculars and telephoto lenses, hoping to capture clearer images if the lights appeared again. And alongside the cameras, researchers began introducing instruments designed to measure the environment itself. Radar systems were occasionally used to detect objects moving through the air. Magnetometers monitored changes in the local magnetic field. Radio receivers scanned for unusual signals. The idea was simple. If the lights were only an optical illusion, the instruments would show nothing. But if something physical was actually present in the sky, there was a chance the equipment might detect it. Over time, the researchers began accumulating a mixture of observations. Some sightings turned out to have ordinary explanations. Distant aircraft, stars appearing brighter through shifting layers of cold air, even reflections from vehicles traveling along roads in the valley. But other observations were more difficult to dismiss. On several occasions, observers reported seeing bright lights moving slowly through the valley, while instruments recorded activity at roughly the same time. In a few cases, radar appeared to detect objects moving through the area where the lights had been seen. Estimating the exact speed and distance of these radar signals was difficult, but the readings suggested that some of the objects might have been moving far faster than the slow, drifting lights that witnesses described with their eyes. That contradiction puzzled researchers. Visually, the lights often appeared calm and slow, but some instrument readings hinted at something moving much faster. Another unusual detail involved the brightness of the lights themselves. Witnesses frequently described the objects as glowing spheres, sometimes white, sometimes yellow or orange, that could change intensity while remaining in roughly the same position. Occasionally, the lights would fade gradually. At other times, they disappeared suddenly, as if switching off. Photographs captured during the observation campaigns showed several different shapes. Some appeared as round, glowing orbs. Others formed elongated streaks, especially when captured with long-exposure photography. In one well-known case, observers reported seeing a single light divide into two separate lights before both gradually faded. Moments like that were difficult to interpret. They might represent unusual atmospheric phenomena, or simply the way moving lights appear through a camera lens. Researchers were careful not to jump to dramatic conclusions. But one thing was becoming clear. The phenomenon was real enough to observe. Lights were appearing in the valley. They were being photographed. And sometimes, they were being recorded by instruments at the same time. Which meant the Hessdalen lights were not simply rumors or isolated anecdotes. Something was happening above the valley. And because it kept happening, scientists had a rare opportunity to keep studying it. Years later, that effort would lead to the installation of a permanent monitoring station in the valley, a set of automated cameras and instruments designed to watch the sky continuously, night after night, season after season, waiting for the lights to appear again. And occasionally, they did, even decades later. And that brings us to something particularly interesting, because in recent years, with modern cameras and better recording technology, some of the clearest footage of the Hessdalen lights has finally begun to appear. During the early observation campaigns in 1983 and 1984, researchers and volunteers spent many long nights watching the sky above Hessdalen Valley. Some nights passed quietly. Nothing unusual appeared. But on other nights, the lights returned. Observers described glowing objects moving slowly along the valley floor, sometimes hovering for extended periods before gradually fading away. Photographs were taken, notes were written, and in several cases, instruments recorded signals at roughly the same time the lights were visible. By 1984, the investigation had already produced something unusual. Not a clear explanation, but enough documented observations to confirm that the phenomenon was worth studying further. After those initial years, the frequency of sightings slowly decreased. The lights did not disappear entirely, but they became less common than during the intense wave of the early 1980s. For a while, the mystery seemed to settle into the background, but the investigation did not end. In 1998, researchers returned with a new idea. Instead of relying only on temporary observation teams, they installed an automated monitoring station in the valley. This station, sometimes referred to as the Automatic Measurement Station, was designed to watch the sky continuously. Cameras pointed toward the hills. Sensors monitored electromagnetic activity. Computers recorded data throughout the night. The goal was simple. If the lights appeared again, the instruments would already be watching. Since the late 1990s, this monitoring system has continued operating as part of Project Hessdalen. Year after year, the equipment quietly records the sky above the valley. Sometimes weeks pass with nothing unusual, but occasionally, the lights appear again. Photographs and videos have continued to accumulate over time, and in recent years, the quality of those recordings has improved significantly. Modern digital cameras, higher sensitivity sensors, and automated detection systems have made it possible to capture clearer footage than the researchers of the 1980s could have imagined. Which brings us to the present day. Even in the 2020s, people are still documenting strange lights appearing above Hessdalen. Some recordings show glowing spheres hovering quietly above the valley. Others capture lights moving slowly across the hills before fading into the darkness. And in 2025, several new recordings began circulating, clearer than much of the older material. In some clips, more than one light appears at once, holding position as if it's hovering, then shifting slowly, changing brightness, and fading out without any obvious source. The lights are clearer and easier to follow as they shift and fade. But strangely, clearer footage has not solved the mystery. If anything, it has made the phenomenon slightly harder to dismiss. Because after more than 40 years of observation, the lights have never completely stopped appearing. Not in 1983, when the first observers waited in the snow to watch the sky. Not in 1998, when automated cameras began monitoring the valley every night, and not even today. Which leaves us with a situation that is both unusual and strangely persistent. A quiet Norwegian valley. Decades of observations. Scientific instruments pointed toward the sky, and lights that still appear from time to time, without a single explanation that fully accounts for them. Now, of course, there are theories. Some researchers believe the lights may be a natural atmospheric phenomenon, possibly involving ionized gases or plasma created by geological conditions in the valley. Others suggest chemical reactions involving dust particles or minerals in the air, and a few scientists believe that several different phenomena may be responsible for different sightings. Personally, after looking at the history of the case, I find the natural explanations more convincing than anything more exotic. But at the same time, it's difficult to ignore the fact that the phenomenon has remained unusually consistent for decades. Lights appearing in the same valley. Observed by residents, photographed by visitors, and occasionally recorded by scientific instruments. Perhaps, with time, the mystery will eventually be resolved. Or perhaps Hessdalen will remain one of those rare places where nature occasionally produces something that still surprises us. Either way, the valley continues to watch the sky, and from time to time, the lights return. And perhaps that's what makes the story of the Hessdalen lights so interesting. Not that the phenomenon has produced dramatic answers, but that it has quietly resisted simple explanations for so long. For more than 40 years, people have watched the skies above Hessdalen Valley. Residents, visitors, and scientists with cameras and instruments pointed into the darkness. And every so often, the lights appear again. Sometimes briefly, sometimes lingering long enough for someone to stop what they're doing and look up. Perhaps the explanation will eventually turn out to be something entirely natural. A rare atmospheric process. An interaction between geology and electricity in the air, or simply a combination of several different phenomena that happen to appear in the same place. But until that explanation is fully understood, the lights of Hessdalen remain one of those quiet mysteries that science continues to observe rather than dismiss. And in a way, that may be the quietest part of the story, because mysteries like this remind us that even in places we think we understand well, there are still moments when the natural world behaves in ways we don't fully expect. If you've come across another interpretation of the Hessdalen lights, or additional details about the observations over the years, I'd be interested to hear about it. And if there's a historical mystery or unexplained event you'd like explored in a future episode, feel free to let me know. Another story coming soon.